on with this war in Ukraine? Should have been over by now through negotiations. Putin's demands have been mostly straightforward, and many think they're doable, and some even believe them to be fairly reasonable. Most importantly, he hasn't changed them since this war began. He's consistently told the various leaders in China, France, Israel, Turkey, and others what he wants, and the goalpost hasn't moved. His main demand is for Ukraine to change its constitution from how it's currently written, asserting its desire to join NATO, to instead stating it will never join. Zelensky has already conceded that Ukraine will not join NATO, but Putin wants it in the constitution. He wants Ukraine to undergo a disarmament process, which Russia is currently doing violently, but he requests that they instead undergo the destruction of the weapons themselves. He wants protection for the Russian language in Ukraine. In certain parts of the country, the Russian language has been forbidden in the public sector, even in areas where the majority of the residents speak Russian as their primary language. Putin also says he wants denazification, and what that means is removing from the government and the military the various openly ultra-nationalist people, organizations, and battalions. Some people point to Zelensky being Jewish, and thus the idea there are Nazis supported by the Ukrainian government is preposterous. But these Nazis don't target Jews. They target anyone who isn't Ukrainian. They are ultra-nationalist, and the people most often caught in their crosshairs are Romans and Russians. They have been supported by the West and Ukraine's government since 2014, and Putin wants them gone. Putin also wants Crimea declared as part of Russia. Now, this is a tougher sell for most people because they view it as a symbol of Russian expansion. But many of us know the Crimean people never fought back against Russia in 2014 because most of them actually welcomed being made part of the country. The region was given to Ukraine in the 50s without the consultation of the people living there. The people overwhelmingly declared their desire to rejoin Russia and even celebrated their arrival. The Donbass region is where things get more complicated. Putin demands the region be declared its own independent nation, but the question is, how much of the region? Some of the Donbass hasn't even been under the control of Ukraine since 2014. The people in that area celebrated Russia's arrival and viewed them as liberators. Many of them have fled into Russia to escape the war. But the full territory of the Donbass is larger than what has been under rebel control, and that's the area, including Mariupol, which will be a sticking point for the two countries. But everything else is fairly reasonable. Zelensky could have conceded some of these things to at least get to a ceasefire while they figure out the Donbass region. So why isn't Zelensky doing it? Why is the U.S. supplying Ukraine with more weapons and encouraging Zelensky to fight rather than seek peace? The response from the West and Zelensky has been to just condemn the invasion and demand Russia leave. That might be right, but it's naive. And in the meantime, people are getting killed. Like it or not, a negotiation has to be had. And this negotiation in particular seems fairly straightforward. At least that's what reasonable people think. But it turns out the people who have the power to influence Zelensky maybe aren't trying to be reasonable. Maybe they have no desire to reach a peace agreement in Ukraine. Maybe they're more interested in bleeding Putin out until his government is ousted. In fact, they've pretty much said as much. In a recent New York Times article published on Saturday, this article detailed the endless back and forth conversations the Pentagon and the White House have been having over which weapons they could supply Ukraine, who could supply them, how they could be supplied, what they can get away with without pissing Putin off too much. This is what the officials in our government spend their time talking about, rather than how to convince Ukraine and Russia into a peaceful coexistence. In his opinion piece for Bloomberg, Neil Ferguson cited a senior administration official who, at a private event earlier this month, stated, "The only endgame now is the end of the Putin regime. Until then, all the time Putin stays, Russia will be a pariah state that will never be welcomed back into the community of nations. China has made a huge error in thinking Putin will get away with it. Seeing Russia get cut off will not look like a good vector, and they'll have to reevaluate the Sino-Russia axis. All this is to say that democracy and the West may look back on this as a pivotal strengthening moment," unquote. So I'd like to know when, in the past 70 years since World War II, the U.S. has strengthened democracy and bettered the lives of people by engaging in proxy wars. When have any of them been pivotal, strengthening moments for the West? Hillary Clinton also alluded to this bleed them out strategy last month while on MSNBC.
But remember, the Russians invaded Afghanistan back in 1980, And although no country went in, they certainly had a lot of countries supplying arms and advice and even some advisors to those who were recruited to fight Russia. It didn't end well for the Russians. There were other unintended consequences, as we know, but the fact is that a very motivated and then funded and armed insurgency basically drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. Obviously, the similarities are not ones that you should bank on because the terrain, the development in urban areas, et cetera, is so different. But I think that is the model that people are now looking toward. And if there can be sufficient armaments that get in, and they should be able to get in along some of the borders between other nations and Ukraine, and keep the Ukrainian, both their military and their citizen volunteer soldiers supplied, that can continue to stymie Russia. Now, let's be clear that Russia has overwhelming military force. But of course, they did in Afghanistan as well. They also brought a lot of air power to Syria. It took years to finally defeat Syria. In terms of the insurgencies, the democratic forces, as well as others who battled the Russians, the Syrians, and the Iranians. So if you're fighting for your homeland, you're fighting for your family, you're fighting for your ideals, that's far more powerful than sending in these poor young Russian soldiers who didn't even know where they were going until they crossed the border and people were screaming at them and they realized they were in Ukraine. So I think we have to watch this carefully. We have to provide sufficient military armaments for the Ukraine military and volunteers. And we have to keep tightening the screws.
Keep tightening the screws, she says. Keep them supplied, according to the Times. That's exactly what the administration is doing. What's interesting is Biden seems hesitant to do this, but Hillary clearly isn't. With Biden's declining faculties, many of us have wondered who behind the scenes is really running things. I don't know. Maybe it's Hillary Clinton calling the shots. It wouldn't surprise me. She certainly has publicly hated Putin since at least 2008, obviously more so after 2016. Many believe she was robbed of her turn to be president and would love to get revenge. So maybe she's pulling an Edith Wilson or a Nancy Reagan. Wouldn't be the first time we had a secret president, but that's pure speculation. Hillary isn't wrong about people fighting for their homeland fiercely, but many of these fighters are not volunteers. They're conscripted. Unlike Afghanistan, many Ukrainians are ethnic Russians. Ukraine was part of the USSR, and it does sit right up on Russia's border. So these factors make Russia less likely to give up like they did in Afghanistan. Also, with all of the immense propaganda on both sides, it's nearly impossible to know how well either side is really doing. And one thing we do know is very few people in our government benefit from a peace agreement being reached between Ukraine and Russia. Hillary Clinton could finally be getting her revenge on Putin for what she perceives as him costing her the presidency. The military-industrial complex is happy to engage in another proxy war that requires an endless profitable stream of American-made weapons being shipped abroad without costing American lives. Even Biden gets to look like a winner for seemingly pushing back against escalating the war, but escalating to full-on NATO or U.S. engagement probably wasn't in the game plan of any of the actual decision makers anyway. They want a proxy war, and they're getting a proxy war. But the more aware of this we are as the American people, the more we can push back on our leaders and demand they behave like the nation we think we are, or at least we want to be. People are sick of endless aggression, regime changes, and proxy wars. People want us to focus on building our own country and investing in our own people. People are tired of us being the world police, providing military defense to an ever-growing list of nations most people have never even heard of. If we must be involved, people want us to be peacemakers and solve world crisis rather than create them. Yet here we are pushing a nation toward destruction on our behalf because we'd love nothing more but to see Putin bled dry. So I would love to see us start to negotiate some peace, but it doesn't sound like from any of the reports going on in the administration that they're actually even discussing that as much. I mean, I hear some reports like, well, maybe we'll start to. But at this point, they're like, which weapons? And it's like, okay, we can't give planes, but let's do drones. I mean, they're kind of deciding which weapons are we going to supply Ukraine in this, rather than encouraging a negotiation between the two. Russia isn't just going to leave on their own.
Yeah, I'm happy to see it. Bleed them dry. Personally, I don't care. I think the collapse of the Putin